Welcome to our deep dive into the fascinating world of genetics. We'll be using Genome, the autobiography of a species in 23 chapters by Matt Ridley as our guide.
An excellent choice.
The book cleverly uses a metaphor to make complex genetic concepts much easier to grasp.
Yes, Ridley compares the human genome to a book, a very intricate book, with 23 chapters, each representing a chromosome.
I see.
And within each chapter, there are thousands of stories, the genes. These stories are made up of paragraphs called exons, with non-coding sections, the introns interspersed throughout.
It's a brilliant analogy to help visualize something so tiny, yet so incredibly complex.
It is, isn't it? The book emphasizes just how much information is packed into our genome.
It's mind-boggling, really.
To give you an idea, if you were to write out the entire human genome letter by letter, it would be as long as the Danube River.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
And if you were to read the genome aloud, at a pace of 1 word per second, it would take an entire century. A century.
That's incredible. It really underscores the sheer volume of information encoded within us. Right from the start, the book challenges our typical understanding of life's beginnings.
It does. It delves into what's known as the RNA world hypothesis.
Oh, yes. The idea that RNA, not DNA, may have been the original molecule of life.
Precisely. Ridley presents 5 compelling clues that suggest RNA may have predated DNA.
Let's hear them. What's the first clue?
Well, the first clue is that the building blocks of DNA are actually derived from RNA.
Interesting.
Secondly, RNA uses uracil, U, which is chemically modified to become thymine, T, in DNA.
Okay, so a direct link there. What's the third clue?
The third clue is the fact that many essential enzymes, crucial for cellular function, rely on RNA to do their job.
So RNA is vital even for the functions of DNA.
Precisely. And the fourth clue is RNA's remarkable ability to self-replicate, something DNA can't do on its own.
So it could have bootstrapped itself, so to speak.
Exactly. And the fifth, and perhaps most compelling clue, is that wherever you look in a cell, the most fundamental processes, the most primitive functions, depend on RNA.
So it seems like RNA really is the foundation upon which life was built, with DNA and proteins evolving later.
That's the hypothesis, and a very intriguing one. This challenges the traditional view of the tree of life, doesn't it?
It does. It really shakes things up.
It does. Ridley even suggests an upside-down tree of life with complex organisms that thrived in cooler environments predating bacteria, which we usually consider the earliest life forms.
That's a pretty radical concept to consider. To think that our understanding of life's history might need such a major revision.
It is, isn't it? But that's the beauty of scientific exploration. It's constantly challenging our assumptions. Now, from life's origins, Ridley shifts to exploring our own ancestry. He delves into how scientists decipher ancestry by comparing genetic spelling changes between species.
Ah, yes. He uses the example of chimpanzees, gorillas, and humans.
Precisely. And by comparing these spelling changes, scientists can determine how closely related different species are.
So what does this comparative analysis reveal about our relationship to these primates?
It clearly shows that chimpanzees are more closely related to humans than they are to gorillas.
How do scientists determine that?
By looking at the number of genetic differences. The fewer the differences, the closer the evolutionary relationship.
So chimpanzees and humans share a more recent common ancestor than chimpanzees and gorillas do.
That's right. And then the question becomes, how did humans diverge so significantly from our ape ancestors?
A good question. And what's Ridley's take on that?
He introduces the concept of a genetic bottleneck. The idea is that at some point in the past, human ancestors went through a period where the population size was drastically reduced.
What could cause such a bottleneck?
Several things. Perhaps geographical isolation, a catastrophic event, or even just a series of unfortunate circumstances.
Right, so the breeding population gets smaller. And what impact does that have?
It leads to reduced genetic variability. Humans actually have less genetic variation than chimpanzees, which is somewhat surprising.
Less variation. But humans are so diverse.
We are, but that diversity comes from a relatively small pool of genetic variation to begin with. It's like having a limited set of ingredients but coming up with many different recipes.
I see. So this bottleneck, this smaller gene pool, set the stage for us to become human.
Precisely. Genetic changes could spread more rapidly within a smaller population. And Ridley puts forward a fascinating idea. A chromosome fusion event that occurred in our lineage.
What does that mean? A chromosome fusion event?
Essentially, 2 chromosomes fused together in our ancestors. This fusion would have made it impossible for these individuals to reproduce with other apes who lacked this fusion.
So, a sudden reproductive barrier.
Yes, leading to reproductive isolation and the divergence of the human lineage. This fusion event serves as a great example of how seemingly random occurrences can drastically change the course of evolution.
It's amazing to think about, isn't it?
It is. From there, Ridley delves into the complex interplay of genes and culture, focusing on the evolution of our brains, those incredibly complex organs.
He suggests that cultural practices like food sharing and the sexual division of labor might have played a role in the development of larger brains in humans.
He does. The idea is that food sharing would have reduced the need for individuals to constantly forage for food.
Freeing up time and energy for other activities,
Exactly. Activities like tool making or developing social structures.
which in turn could have driven the evolution of bigger, more complex brains.
It's a fascinating idea, isn't it? A kind of feedback loop between cultural practices and genetic changes, each influencing the other.
It highlights the intricate dance between nature and nurture in shaping who we are. But it's important to remember that many theories about human evolution are still speculative, right?
Of course. These theories highlight areas for further research, and as we gather more evidence, our understanding will undoubtedly continue to evolve. Now, shifting gears a bit, Ridley takes us into the groundbreaking work of Archibald Garrod.
A physician who made incredible discoveries about the role of genes in human health.
Precisely. He focused on what he called inborn errors of metabolism, particularly a condition called alkaptonuria.
Alkaptonuria. That's the condition where a person's urine turns black, right?
Yes, quite a striking symptom. Garrod was fascinated by this, and through careful observation and analysis, he concluded that it was caused by a malfunctioning enzyme, a result of a mutation in a specific gene.
This is a revolutionary concept.
Yeah.
Connecting a specific gene to a specific disease.
It was, and what's even more remarkable is that he made this discovery long before scientists even knew the structure of DNA.
Decades before Watson and Crick's famous double helix.
Exactly. Garrod's groundbreaking insight was that genes produce specific chemical catalysts, what we now call enzymes, and that mutations in these genes can lead to disease.
It's incredible to think that he was able to make such a profound discovery with the limited tools available at the time.
He truly was ahead of his time. And sadly, his ideas weren't immediately accepted. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, with the rediscovery of Mendel's laws and the rise of modern genetics, that the significance of his work was truly appreciated.
A classic case of being ahead of the curve.
Indeed. Ridley highlights how modern genetics has been able to confirm Garrod's findings, pinpointing the exact gene responsible for alkaptonuria and the specific mutation that causes the defective enzyme. It's a beautiful testament to the power of scientific progress.
A validation of Garrod's pioneering work. And from there, the field of gene hunting took off. Scientists began searching for the genetic roots of other diseases.
And one of the most captivating stories of gene hunting is Nancy Wexler's search for the Huntington's disease gene. Ridley does a great job recounting her journey.
He talks about her going to Venezuela, where she found a large extended family with a high incidence of Huntington's disease.
Yes, this family proved to be invaluable for gene mapping, and eventually scientists were able to locate the Huntington's disease gene.
It really underscores the importance of family histories and genetic studies in unraveling the secrets of our genes.
Absolutely. But with genetic testing comes a host of ethical considerations, especially for incurable diseases like Huntington's.
It's a heavy burden to know your genetic risk, and it raises complex questions about individual autonomy, privacy, and the psychological impact of such knowledge.
Very complex. These are issues we need to grapple with as our understanding of the genome grows.
Absolutely. Speaking of complexity, Ridley also addresses the challenges of understanding gene-behavior relationships. He uses asthma as a prime example.
Yes, asthma is a complex disorder influenced by multiple genes and environmental factors. It's not like Huntington's, which is caused by a single gene mutation.
So finding the asthma gene is a much trickier proposition.
It is. And Ridley uses the ADRB2 gene to illustrate this point. This gene codes for a protein involved in airway constriction and dilation. Mutations in this gene have been linked to asthma susceptibility.
So there is a genetic component.
There is. But what's fascinating is that the same mutation can have different, even contradictory effects on asthma in different individuals.
Depending on environmental factors.
Exactly. It highlights the complexity of gene-environment interactions and how they shape our health. And this complexity becomes even more apparent when we delve into the genetics of intelligence, a topic that has always generated a lot of debate.
Ridley presents evidence from twin and adoption studies, suggesting that intelligence is, at least in part, heritable.
He does. These studies show a significant genetic contribution to intelligence, but it's crucial to understand what heritable really means in this context.
It doesn't mean our intelligence is fixed or predetermined by our genes, right?
Precisely. It's more nuanced than that. Ridley proposes that the heritability of IQ might be linked to genes that influence our resilience to environmental stresses. He even uses the correlation between IQ and bodily symmetry as an example.
Bodily symmetry. What's the connection there?
Well, research suggests that people with higher IQs tend to have more symmetrical bodies.
Really? I never
Yeah.
knew that.
Bodily asymmetry can indicate developmental stress, like exposure to toxins or infections early in life.
Ah, so genes that give us resilience to these stresses might indirectly contribute to higher intelligence.
That's the idea. It's not about genes directly coding for intelligence, but rather about genes that affect our ability to develop our full intellectual potential in a given environment.
So it's still a nature and nurture interplay.
It is. Ridley also discusses Robert Plumman's research. Plumman has spent years looking for specific genes associated with intelligence.
And he found one, right, on chromosome 6.
He did, the IGF2R gene, and studies have shown a correlation between this gene and IQ.
So there's a gene for intelligence.
Not quite. The fascinating thing is that the IGF2R gene is primarily known for its role in liver cancer.
Liver cancer, that seems completely unrelated.
It does, doesn't it? But that's the point. It highlights the complex and often unexpected nature of gene function. A single gene can be involved in seemingly unrelated processes.
So it's not a simple case of a gene for intelligence, but rather a gene with multiple functions, one of which might influence cognitive abilities.
Precisely. And it's very likely that many other genes contribute to intelligence, each with small effects, interacting with each other and with the environment in incredibly complex ways.
It makes you realize just how much we still have to learn about the genome.
It does. Speaking of complex abilities, Ridley also explores the fascinating world of language and its potential genetic underpinnings.
He delves into the idea of an innate language instinct, as proposed by Noam Chomsky.
Yes, the idea that humans are born with an inherent capacity for language, a kind of pre-wiring that allows us to learn and use language with such ease. Ridley presents several lines of evidence to support this idea.
Like what?
Well, for one, the universality of language across cultures. Every human society, regardless of its level of technological development, has a complex language.
It's true. Language is a universal human trait.
It is. And this suggests that language isn't merely a cultural invention, but a fundamental aspect of being human.
Perhaps rooted in our genes.
Exactly. Another piece of evidence is the consistent structure of grammar across languages. While languages may differ in vocabulary and sounds, they share underlying grammatical principles.
There's a kind of universal grammar.
Precisely. And this universal grammar could very well be hardwired into our brains.
It's mind-boggling to think that such a complex ability could have a genetic basis.
It is. Ridley takes this exploration further by looking at the challenges faced by individuals with specific language impairment, or SLI.
People who have difficulty with language despite having normal intelligence.
Yes. He discusses a fascinating case, the KE family. This family has a specific difficulty with grammatical rules.
So they struggle with grammar, even though they're otherwise intelligent.
Exactly. And this suggests that specific genes might be involved in our ability to process and understand grammar. The KE family's language impairment points to a genetic basis for this complex cognitive function.
It's amazing to think about the potential of our genes, the hidden talent or abilities that might be encoded in our DNA, waiting to be expressed.
It is. And as we delve deeper into the genome, I'm sure we'll uncover even more fascinating connections between our genes and our abilities, our behaviors, and ultimately what makes us human.
And now we delve into the world of the X and the Y, the chromosomes that determine our biological sex.
Exactly. Ridley highlights the SRY gene, which is located on the Y chromosome. This gene acts as a master switch for maleness.
So if the SRY gene is present, the individual typically develops as male.
Right. Of course, there are exceptions, but generally, the SRY gene plays a crucial role in sex determination.
This difference in sex chromosomes leads to some really interesting evolutionary dynamics.
It does. Ridley discusses the concept of sexually antagonistic genes, genes that benefit one sex but come at a cost to the other.
Almost like an evolutionary arms race between males and females.
That's a great way to put it. He uses William Rice's research on fruit flies to illustrate this concept.
What did Rice find?
Rice discovered that male fruit flies produce seminal fluid that contains proteins that can actually manipulate female behavior.
Really? Manipulate how?
Well, these proteins can decrease the female's receptivity to mating and increase her ovulation rate.
Wow. So it's almost as if the male's genes are trying to override the female's reproductive control.
You could say that it's a clear example of sexual conflict, where the evolutionary interests of males and females are at odds.
The male's genes are wired to maximize his reproductive success, even if it means compromising the female's well-being.
That's the essence of it. But of course, females aren't just passive participants in this genetic tug-of-war.
They evolve their own countermeasures.
Exactly. Females evolve ways to resist this manipulation and maintain control over their own reproductive choices. It's a constant back and forth, an evolutionary dance, so to speak.
It's a really fascinating example of the dynamic nature of the genome.
It is. And it shows how evolution is constantly shaping and reshaping life. Ridley also briefly touches upon a topic that was quite controversial.
The idea of a gay gene.
Yes. This refers to research by Dean Hamer, who suggested a link between a region on the X chromosome and male sexual orientation.
I remember that study. There was a lot of discussion about it.
There was. Hamer's study found that gay men were more likely to share a certain genetic marker on the X chromosome than straight men.
But does this mean there's a single gene that determines sexual orientation?
Not at all. Ridley points out that the genetics of sexual orientation are complex and likely involve multiple genes and environmental factors. It's not a simple one gene, one trait situation.
It would be too simplistic to think that such a complex aspect of human identity could be reduced to a single gene.
I agree. Now, shifting gears, Ridley introduces the concept of the genome as an ecosystem.
An ecosystem, what does he mean by that?
He's referring to the fact that our genome is not just a static set of genes. It's a dynamic environment where selfish genetic elements can exist.
Selfish elements, like what?
He talks about things like ALU sequences and line 1s, which are repetitive DNA sequences that can replicate and spread within the genome.
And they don't really do anything useful for the organism.
Not really. They can even be harmful, sometimes disrupting the function of other genes. Ridley compares them to parasites.
So these selfish elements are just looking out for themselves, so to speak.
In a way, yes. They prioritize their own replication and spread, even if it's not beneficial or even detrimental to the organism as a whole.
It's a fascinating illustration of the selfish gene concept at work.
It is. But of course, not all genetic elements are selfish. Ridley also discusses hypervariable mini-satellites.
I'm not familiar with those.
They're short, repetitive DNA sequences that are highly variable between individuals.
Okay, so what's their significance?
Their variability makes them incredibly useful for a technique called DNA fingerprinting. This technique, as Ridley explains, was developed by Alec Jeffreys.
DNA fingerprinting has revolutionized forensic science.
Absolutely. Ridley even recounts a case where DNA fingerprinting was used to exonerate a man who was wrongly convicted of murder.
It's a powerful example of how genetic knowledge can be used to pursue justice.
It is, and it highlights the incredible power of these hypervariable regions to distinguish individuals.
Speaking of genetic variation, Ridley also explores the world of blood groups.
Yes, blood groups are a classic example of genetic diversity within a species. He focuses mainly on the ABO blood group system.
The most well-known blood group system. It's what determines whether someone has A, B, or O blood type.
Exactly. And this system is determined by a gene on chromosome 9.
Right, and it's crucial for blood transfusions.
Absolutely. The ABO system determines the presence or absence of certain antigens on the surface of red blood cells. And if you receive a blood transfusion with the wrong blood type, your immune system can attack the foreign blood cells.
Which can lead to a serious, even fatal reaction.
That's right. So matching blood types is crucial for safe transfusions. But blood groups aren't just about transfusions.
What else are they important for?
Well, Ridley explains that different blood groups can influence susceptibility to certain diseases.
Interesting. So your blood type can actually affect your health.
It can. He gives the example of the AB blood type, which seems to offer some protection against cholera.
So there's an evolutionary advantage to having certain blood types in certain environments.
Precisely. And the distribution of different blood types around the world is not random.
It reflects human migration patterns and the evolutionary pressures faced by different populations.
Exactly. It's like our blood carries a record of our ancestors' journeys. Now, shifting gears again, Ridley explores the complex interplay between our genes, our environment, and our health through the lens of stress and immunity.
He talks about cortisol, the so-called stress hormone.
Right. Cortisol is released by our bodies in response to stress. And as Ridley explains, cortisol has a significant impact on the immune system.
I've heard that stress can suppress the immune system, making you more susceptible to getting sick.
That's right. It's part of the body's fight or flight response. When we're faced with a threat, our bodies prioritize dealing with the immediate danger, even if it means temporarily compromising our long-term health.
But why would our bodies evolve a system that weakens our defenses when we're under stress? It seems counterintuitive.
It's a good question, and scientists are still trying to fully understand it. Ridley presents several possibilities. One idea is that it might be an energy-saving mechanism. When we're stressed, our bodies need to conserve energy, and suppressing the immune response, which is quite energy-intensive, could help achieve that.
So it's a trade-off. Deal with the immediate stressor, even if it means increasing the risk of getting sick later.
Exactly. Another possibility is that it's a side effect of the body's response to testosterone, which has a similar chemical structure to cortisol. This testosterone response might have evolved because females may favor males who are more resistant to disease.
So it could be a case of sexual selection shaping our stress response.
Possibly. And this brings up a really important point that Ridley makes. He challenges the traditional view of genes as the sole drivers of behavior.
We're not just puppets of our genes.
Exactly. Our environment and behavior can actually influence how our genes are expressed.
He uses a rather dramatic example to illustrate this point. Bungee jumping.
He does. The idea is that engaging in thrilling or stressful activities, like bungee jumping, triggers a surge in cortisol, which directly impacts our biology, including our immune function.
So our experiences can actually alter our internal environment, our physiology.
Precisely. Our biology is much more dynamic than we often realize. Now let's move into the realm of personality. Ridley explores the fascinating connections between personality, genes, and the environment. He focuses on novelty-seeking behavior and its potential genetic links.
He talks about the D4DR gene, right? The one that codes for a dopamine receptor.
Yes, dopamine is a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward, and variations in the D4DR gene can influence how sensitive we are to dopamine. This, in turn, could affect personality traits like novelty-seeking.
So some people might be genetically predisposed to seek out new experiences.
That's the idea. Ridley highlights Dean Hamer's research, which found a correlation between a specific variant of the D4DR gene, the long variant, and novelty-seeking behavior.
What kind of novelty-seeking behavior?
People with this gene variant were more likely to engage in behaviors like exploring new places, trying new foods, or having multiple sexual partners. It suggests a genetic influence on our desire for new and stimulating experiences.
But, like with most complex traits, genes are only part of the story.
Absolutely. Environment and personal choices play a huge role. A gene might increase the likelihood of certain behaviors, but it doesn't determine them.
It's a good reminder that we have agency. We can choose how we want to live our lives, even if we have certain genetic predispositions.
Exactly. Now, Ridley also discusses Jerome Kagan's research on shyness, which takes a different approach, suggesting a link between personality and physical development.
Physical development, how does that relate to shyness?
Well, Kagan observed that shy individuals often share certain physical characteristics, like blue eyes, a slender build, and a tendency towards allergies.
Really? I never made that connection.
It's an interesting observation, and Kagan proposed that these characteristics, along with shyness, might be linked to an overactive norepinephrine system.
Norepinephrine is another neurotransmitter, like dopamine.
Yes, and it's involved in the stress response. So Kagan's research suggests a fascinating connection between personality, physical traits, and the underlying biology of the nervous system. It's a reminder that our genes, our brains, and our bodies are all interconnected.
It's amazing how these seemingly disparate aspects of ourselves can be woven together in such complex ways.
It is, and it highlights how much we still have to learn about the human organism. Now, shifting our focus to the broader implications of genetic knowledge, Ridley explores the ethical and philosophical dilemmas that arise when we consider the power of genes to predict and potentially manipulate our health and behavior. He uses the example of the APOE gene, which is linked to an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease.
A rather sobering example.
It is. Knowing your APOE genotype can reveal your likelihood of developing Alzheimer's. But, as Ridley points out, this knowledge can be a double-edged sword.
How so?
On one hand, it can empower individuals to make informed decisions about their health and lifestyle. Someone with a high genetic risk might choose to focus on a healthy diet, exercise, or even participate in research studies for new treatments.
So it can motivate positive action.
Exactly. But on the other hand, knowing you have a higher risk for an incurable disease can be a source of anxiety and distress. And there's also the concern about potential discrimination.
Discrimination from whom?
Well, insurance companies, for example, might use this information to deny coverage or charge higher premiums. Or employers might discriminate against individuals with certain genetic predispositions.
That's a scary thought. Using genetic information to deny people opportunities.
It is a concern. And Ridley criticizes the practice of genetic cherry picking by insurance companies. This is where they offer lower premiums to individuals with favorable genetic profiles while denying coverage or charging exorbitant rates to those with higher risks.
So access to healthcare becomes dependent on your genes.
In a way, yes. And this could create even greater inequalities in healthcare. It highlights the need for strong ethical guidelines and legal protections to ensure that genetic information is used responsibly and equitably.
We need to make sure that everyone has equal access to healthcare, regardless of their genes.
Absolutely. And that's a core ethical principle that we need to uphold as our genetic knowledge and technology advance. Now, Ridley takes us on a fascinating detour, challenging traditional genetic determinism by introducing us to the world of prions.
Prions, those are misfolded proteins that can cause some pretty nasty diseases, right?
Yes. Ridley describes Kuru, a prion disease that affected a tribe in Papua New Guinea. It was spread through ritual cannibalism where people consumed the brains of deceased relatives.
That's a rather disturbing practice.
It is. And unfortunately, this practice led to the transmission of the infectious prions, causing a devastating epidemic of Kuru.
A tragic example of how cultural practices can intersect with biology with unintended consequences.
It is. But what makes prions so interesting from a scientific perspective is that they challenge the central dogma of molecular biology.
The dogma that genetic information flows from DNA to RNA to protein.
Exactly. Prions can transmit information and cause disease without involving DNA or RNA at all.
So they operate outside the typical rules of genetic inheritance.
You could say that. Prions are proteins that can induce other proteins to misfold, creating a chain reaction that spreads the disease. This challenges the idea that proteins are just passive molecules and highlights the complexity of biological systems.
Like a rogue protein that can hijack the cellular machinery.
That's a good analogy. And prion diseases demonstrate the limitations of reductionist, deterministic models of biology.
We can't always predict how biological systems will behave based on simple rules.
Precisely. Now, turning to a darker chapter in the history of genetics, Ridley explores the era of eugenics.
Eugenics is a term laden with a lot of historical baggage.
It is. Ridley traces the origins of eugenics to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time when ideas about heredity and social Darwinism were gaining popularity.
It was a time when people were trying to apply evolutionary principles to society, often with misguided and harmful results.
Exactly. Ridley discusses figures like Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics and advocated for selective breeding to improve the human race.
A rather disturbing idea.
It is, and it's unsettling to think that these ideas were widely accepted at the time. Many prominent scientists, politicians, and social reformers endorsed eugenic views.
Ridley talks about the near passage of eugenic laws in Britain, which would have restricted the reproduction of individuals deemed unfit.
Yes. Thankfully, these laws were ultimately rejected, thanks in part to those who recognized the dangers and ethical violations inherent in coercive eugenics.
It's a stark reminder that even seemingly scientific ideas can be intertwined with social biases and prejudices, leading to harmful outcomes.
A crucial lesson from history. Ridley strongly condemns the coercive nature of eugenics, which often involved forced sterilization and other human rights abuses. He emphasizes the importance of individual rights and autonomy in any discussion of genetic manipulation.
We should never allow the state or any other powerful entity to dictate who should and shouldn't reproduce.
I agree. It's a dangerous path to go down. Now, finally, Ridley concludes his exploration of the genome with a profound reflection on the paradox of free will in the face of genetic determinism.
It's a question that has puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries. If our genes influence our behavior, do we truly have free will?
It's a complex issue. Ridley acknowledges that our genes do indeed influence our behavior, predisposing us to certain traits and tendencies. But he also emphasizes the subjective experience of free will, our ability to make choices and shape our own destinies.
So it's not a simple either proposition.
Exactly. He presents various perspectives on free will, from Charles Darwin, who saw it as an illusion, to more contemporary views that emphasize the role of free will in our social interactions and moral reasoning.
It doesn't seem like there's an easy answer.
There isn't. Ridley proposes an interesting idea. He suggests that free will might emerge from the complex interplay between our gene, environment, and our conscious choices.
It's not just nature versus nurture, it's a more nuanced interplay.
Right. He points to the concept of circular causality between genes and behavior,
Meaning,
meaning that our genes can influence our behavior, but our behavior can also influence how our genes are expressed. For example, experiences like stress can alter gene expression and even affect the structure of our brains.
our experiences can shape our biology, which in turn can shape our behavior.
Exactly. It's a dynamic interplay.
Well,
And this circular causality creates a complex system where unpredictable outcomes can arise, even from seemingly deterministic processes. It suggests that we are more than just the sum of our genes.
that we have the power to shape our own destinies to some extent.
I think that's a key takeaway from Ridley's exploration of the genome. We are not simply puppets of our genes. We have agency, we have the ability to make choices, and those choices have real consequences. And it's a fitting note on which to conclude our journey through Ridley's fascinating book. It's a book that challenges our assumptions, expands our understanding, and ultimately, I think, gives us a deeper appreciation for the wonders of life.
It really is remarkable. Such profound complexity arising from our genetic code.
It is. Ridley's exploration of the genome leaves us with this sense of awe, this wonder. It reminds us that we're really just scratching the surface of understanding this incredibly intricate blueprint of life.
And he emphasizes that understanding our genes isn't about predicting our fate.
Right. It's not about determinism.
It's about empowering us to make informed decisions.
Exactly. Recognizing the interplay between our genetic predispositions and the choices we make throughout life. We're not just puppets of our genes. We're active participants in shaping our destinies.
And he stresses the responsibility that comes with this knowledge.
He does. We need to use it wisely for the benefit of individuals and society as a whole.
He envisions a future where genetic knowledge is used to promote health and well-being, to enhance human flourishing.
Precisely. But as you can imagine, this vision requires careful consideration of the ethical implications.
Of course, as our understanding of the genome deepens and our ability to manipulate it grows, we need to be mindful of the potential consequences.
Absolutely, both intended and unintended. It's a call for a thoughtful, informed dialogue.
A dialogue that involves everyone, scientists, policymakers, ethicists, and the public at large. It's a conversation we all need to be a part of.
I agree. Ridley's book, in a way, serves as a wake-up call. It reminds us that the human genome is this vast, uncharted territory, full of secrets yet to be revealed.
And as we continue to explore this remarkable book of life, we're bound to uncover even more profound insights into our own nature and our place in the universe.
It's a journey that promises to challenge our assumptions, to expand our understanding.
And ultimately, to enrich our lives. It's been a fascinating journey exploring the intricacies of the human genome through Matt Ridley's insightful lens.
It has. He combines scientific storytelling with thought-provoking analysis in a way that makes these complex concepts accessible and engaging. It's a book I'd highly recommend to anyone curious about the secrets of life, the power of genes, and the nature of being human.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this sense of wonder and a renewed appreciation for the intricate beauty and complexity of the human genome. It's a reminder that we're all connected by our shared genetic heritage, a product of billions of years of evolution.
It's humbling, isn't it, to think about the vastness of time and the intricate processes that have led to who we are today.
It is. And as we continue to unravel the mysteries of this inheritance, we're embarking on a journey of self-discovery, a journey that will undoubtedly shape our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world for generations to come.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the human genome. We encourage you to delve deeper into this fascinating subject and to continue marveling at the wonders of life.